Are we good? Okay, thank you for being here today. My name is Fareed Khan. I'm the founder of Canadians United Against Hate. And joining me today via video is Rabbi David Mivasair, a member of Independent Jewish Voices and a human rights activist, and Professor Nadia Abu-Zahra, who teaches at the University of Ottawa and is a researcher with the university's Human Rights Research and Education Center. I'd like to point out that today is World Refugee Day, International World Refugee Day, and it's very appropriate that we're talking about the subject that we will be speaking on, because what is happening in Gaza today has created the worst refugee crisis since, frankly, the Rohingya genocide a number of years ago. School ends today for a lot of students. Parliament is coming to an end. And since summer vacation is upon us, students are receiving their year-end report cards. And so it's only fitting that our parliamentarians also get graded for their human rights and anti-racism work since last fall. Unfortunately, the news is not good for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre. Canadians United Against Hate is giving both leaders grades of F for their abysmal and inadequate responses to the murder and suffering of thousands of Palestinians in the Gaza genocide, their unwavering support for Israel's genocidal regime, and their enabling of anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia in Canada over the past 8 months through their words and actions. By comparison, the responses and actions of the NDP, Bloc Québécois, and Green Party leaders to the horrors Israel is committing have each received grades of B. While the leaders of those parties got off to a shaky start, they soon found their human rights voices and have repeatedly called on the Trudeau government to demand a ceasefire, stop selling weapons to Israel, and condemn Israeli leaders for committing genocide. For 8 months, Palestinian Canadians and their allies in the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian communities, along with hundreds of thousands of ordinary Canadians, have been taking to the streets in weekly demonstrations in cities and towns across Canada, calling on our leaders to take meaningful action to help the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, Justin Trudeau, along with his ministers and a number of Liberal MPs, and Pierre Poilievre and the entire Conservative caucus have chosen to ignore Canadians and instead to side with a genocidal regime. That decision not only supports a nation that is committing acts of pure evil, it makes Canada today no different than the Canada of the 1930s, which did nothing to help Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. Canadians United Against Hate also issued a failing grade to all the MPs who voted against the NDP motion about recognizing Palestinian statehood and calling for a ceasefire. The entire Conservative caucus and several Liberal MPs voted against the motion, which ultimately passed. But in doing so, they said to Canadians they were for war crimes, for genocide, for mass starvation, and against helping a people suffering horrors we can't even imagine. These MPs showed their failure as decent human beings and their lack of basic humanity towards Palestinians by voting against that motion. I'd also like to call attention to the explosion in anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism since last fall. While there have been many statements condemning the rise in anti-Semitism, there has been far less attention paid by political leaders to the explosion in racism against Palestinians and Islamophobia. In fact, Canadian politicians, corporate leaders, and university administrators have enabled hate against Palestinians and Muslims by condemning pro-Palestinian protests and labeling them as anti-Semitic. The only parties that have taken a moral stand in defense of Palestinian rights are the NDP, Bloc, and Green Party, which have regularly been calling attention to the crimes being committed by Israel. And while there is room for improvement in some respects, these are parties that are showing leadership and a commitment to defending the basic human rights of Palestinians and upholding an international legal order which Trudeau and Poilievre seem to think is only there to help white Europeans, like Ukrainians facing Russian aggression. The past 8 months have shown us the face of Canada's political, corporate, academic, and news media leaders, and that face is distinctly racist against Palestinians. And it's one dripping in moral failure. It seems that the awareness about racism and commitments that were made by leaders to do better, which we saw following the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in the US and the murder of the Afzaal family in London by a white supremacist, were largely performative PR. The true face of political and institutional racism in Canada has been laid bare by the response of elites to the genocide in Gaza. It seems that political and economic support for people and society facing violent oppression and aggression is only available if they are white and Christian like the Ukrainians. But if you're brown, and especially if you're Palestinian and Muslim, then you shouldn't expect your rights to be protected. My late wife was a professor who taught in the area of anti-racism and social justice. She was the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. And my father-in-law was only one of 4 in his extended family to survive the concentration camps. If she and my father-in-law were alive today and saw the horrors inflicted on Palestinians in their name, they would be appalled and would, like many other Jews, be speaking out against those using Jewish suffering in the Holocaust to justify atrocities against Palestinians. As a professor, my wife would not only have given Trudeau and Poilievre grades of F, she would say that neither is fit to hold public office, given their responses to the Gaza genocide since last fall. The only thing that can change these evaluations of Pierre Trudeau and or Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre is if Canadian leaders unequivocally condemn Israel for its genocidal crimes. If Canada institutes a two-way arms embargo by neither selling Canadian weapons to Israel nor buying Israeli-made weapons. If Canada supports South Africa's genocide case against the ICJ and supports the International Criminal Court in its investigation of genocidal crimes by Israeli leaders. If Canada follows the lead of 145 countries around the world by recognizing the state of Palestine, which is the right thing to do and long overdue. And if political leaders stop demonizing pro-Palestinian protesters who are in touch with their humanity and their soul, unlike many of our political leaders. With over 45,000 Palestinians murdered by Israel to date, action is needed immediately to stop the slaughter. Trudeau and Poilievre can make it happen if they can only find their humanity, which they have abandoned when it comes to Palestinian suffering. Justin, Pierre, you need to do far better, because right now your legacy will be that of men complicit in genocide. I would now like to call on Professor Abu-Zahra to speak.
The criteria for a report card should be the criteria of the public, the Canadian public. An eco-survey of Canadians found that a significant majority, 74%, of Canadians want the government to express opposition to Israeli annexation. In March this year, over 200 Canadian members of Parliament voted in a motion toward recognizing the State of Palestine. Even before Israel's actions for the past 8 months, nearly half of Canadians wanted Canada to impose economic or diplomatic sanctions against Israel. 4 out of 5 Canadians, including the majority of supporters of the Conservative Party, want Canada to maintain its current policy on Jerusalem and continue to call for the city to be shared. A strong majority, 95%, of Canadians want the International Criminal Court to investigate alleged war crimes wherever they occur, including in Israel. Canadians also support the independence of the ICC and do not want Canada to intervene. In February of 2020, the Canadian government tried to deter the ICC investigation into alleged Israeli and Palestinian war crimes. When Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu asked Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to discourage the International Criminal Court at The Hague from investigating the 2014 assault by Israel against Palestinians in Gaza, during which Israel killed over 550 children, Canada wrote to the court that Palestinians as stateless people had no right to bring cases for war crimes. Canada also did not call for U.S. sanctions to be lifted on the ICC chief prosecutor and another ICC official. When the ICC recently requested arrest warrants for Netanyahu and others as suspects for war crimes and crimes against humanity, Canada found this unhelpful, I'm quoting, and failed to unequivocally support it. The Conservative Party, meanwhile, unequivocally rejected the actions of the International Criminal Court. Canada played a pivotal role establishing the ICC in the 1990s, and Canada signed the Rome Statute of the ICC in 1998. In the year 2000, Canada was the first country in the world to adopt comprehensive legislation respecting the International Criminal Court. 90% of Canadians believe Canada should not overlook human rights violations of allied countries like Israel. Community groups representing 2 million people across Canada are calling for a two-way arms embargo against Israel. Some analysts believe what could make the most difference to Israel's violations of human rights is ending Canada's diplomatic support for these human rights violations. The Trudeau government has voted against dozens of United Nations resolutions that affirm existing policies of Canadian foreign policy, such as United Nations Resolution 1796, guaranteeing the protections of the Geneva Convention to Palestinian civilians. Liberal members of Parliament, however, have spoken up for human rights. In January 2024, signatories of a joint Canadian, American, and German legislators' open letter calling for a ceasefire included Salma Zahid, Nate Erskine-Smith, Ariel Kayabaga, Shafqat Ali, John Aldag, Paul Chang, Adam van Koeverden, Yasser Naqvi, Jennifer O'Connell, and Mark Garriston. In March this year, Canada did restore funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. NDP members of Parliament who have actively represented their constituencies on international human rights include Jagmeet Singh, Nikki Ashton, Matthew Green, Alexandre Bouleris, Heather McPherson, former MP Charlie Angus, Jenny Kwan, Don Davies, Lisa Marie Barron, Laurel Collins, Brian Massey, and Lindsay Matheson, among others. Green Party leaders supporting international human rights include Elizabeth May, Jonathan Pedneau, and MP Mike Morris. The Green Party and NDP have been calling for a two-way arms embargo for months. The Liberal government approved at least 28.5 million Canadian dollars in new permits for military exports to Israel during the first months of Israel's genocide against Palestine. This is the highest weapons and equipment exports to Israel ever and includes bombs, torpedoes, rockets, other explosive devices, and more. The Liberal government tried to label these as non-lethal. At the time, genocide scholars and United Nations special rapporteurs were issuing open and clear statements about the ongoing genocide. The Liberal government has also not ruled out buying Israeli military hardware, including those tested on Palestinian civilians. Israel has killed over 45,000 civilians, not including those under the rubble or marred to the point of non-recognition, including more than 15,000 children in the past 8 months alone. Canada can and must do better.
Thank you, Professor. I'd now like to call on Rabbi David Mivasair, who's joining us remotely by video.
Rabbi, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, of course, I appreciate everything that Fareed and Nadia have said before me, and I want to add a few points rather than repeat anything that they've already said. Just relating to Canada's failure to uphold the rules-based international order, commitment to human rights and international law, besides the direct harms to people living in Palestine, I think our government is also failing to maintain Canada's role in the world as a positive influence on global affairs. It discredits the image of Canada, built over generations, to destroy the congruence between proclamations that our government makes and the actions that we see it taking at this time. But I want to talk about 3 other issues, and if I were to give them a grade, I would sadly give our the governing party, the Liberals, an F, and the Conservatives as well. So one of those issues is our government's failure to provide humanitarian refuge to people living in Gaza who, through no fault of their own, are suffering indescribable conditions. And this has been going on for 8 months. Canada has given refuge to people, as we've said before, from the Ukraine, from Syria, and from elsewhere. Hundreds of thousands of visas were given to Ukrainians. Our Prime Minister went himself to the airport with a bouquet of flowers in his arms to welcome Syrians. In great contrast to this, even family members of Canadians who live in Gaza have not been able to actually come to Canada with this special visa program that was announced with such fanfare in December, several months after this crisis began. Here we are in June, and to my knowledge, no one has actually been able to enter Canada under this program. The program first was capped at 1,000 people, even though thousands of Canadians applied for visas for their family members to be able to come here. The cap was recently lifted to 5,000, but still the program is so restrictive because every single person in Gaza is treated as a security risk. Everyone from like 90-year-olds to 9-month-year-olds. They have to be recorded with every mark and every scar on their body. They have to report every job they ever had. They go through extremely strict security vetting. The same thing was not done to people from other countries. So this particular project was an urgent humanitarian project to save even family members of Canadians. This government definitely gets an F. Another score that I want to look at is the fairness and upholding Canadian law regarding charitable donations that are being used for activities in Israel, which are strictly illegal. They're in violation of Canadian law. They violate Canadian foreign policy. Last year alone, close to $250 million of Canadian tax-deducted charitable donations were given to organizations in Israel that do things like funding and promoting settlements in the West Bank across the Green Line in an area that Canadian foreign policy deems as occupied territory. Funds have even been used to provide weapons and surveillance material and vehicles for violent settlers who directly attack Indigenous Palestinian people living on their land. This has been reported over and over to the Canada Revenue Agency. I've filed formal legal complaints with no evidence that the CRA is acting on these at all. So the CRA is under control of the Liberal government. It has been for years, and they deserve an F for their failure to enforce our own Canadian law and to continue to give tax deduction for false charitable contributions to these illegal activities. The last thing that I want to talk about is our government's stance on anti-Semitism. So again, with great fanfare, the Trudeau government created an office they call the Special Envoy on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism. It could be a worthy thing to do. I don't know if we have special envoys on any other international issues or some generations ago in lands far away, horrible tragedies that have been perpetrated, such as the Holocaust in Europe against the Jewish people. But we do have this office. This office was filled by Deborah Lyons, who was a seasoned diplomat, was appointed by Justin Trudeau in 2023 to be the special envoy on Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. However, since her appointment, she's used that office to promote support for Israel and blatantly support Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian hate in Canada. She promotes the very manipulated definition of anti-Semitism created by something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, which was itself created in order to deem honest, straightforward talk about Palestine and about Israel as being anti-Semitic as a way to suppress it. That's one of her priorities. She's demonized Palestinian Canadians and their supporters, including many Jewish people such as myself. And our organizations, like Independent Jewish Voices, If Not Now, Jews Say No to Genocide, and others. She's made false claims about slogans that we use, such as "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," as being anti-Semitic and needing to be criminalized. So Deborah Lyons needs to be replaced if the Trudeau government is interested in not having an F. They need to find someone else to be a special envoy for Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism, who does that without spreading anti-Palestinian hatred and Islamophobia. The last thing I'll point out is there was an incident right here in Ontario on December 8th last year when the RCMP arrested 2 members of the Atomwaffen, which is a violent neo-Nazi organization that is devoted to committing violence against people like Jews. And the RCMP arrested them on terrorism charges on December 8th. There was no comment on that from our special envoy appointed by the Trudeau government. So that's just one indication of the failure. And there are other points that we can talk about, but I think I'll just wrap up my comments with that and turn it back to Fareed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Just before opening questions, I would like to note that in a couple of weeks we'll be celebrating Canada Day, or Canadians will be celebrating Canada Day. I and many others will not be celebrating because right now there is nothing to celebrate. What we have seen over the last 8 months in Canada is one racist nation, a racist political elite, corporate elite, university administration elites, and news media executives who have suppressed stories about the suffering of Palestinians. If we want to actually see ourselves as a nation that is supporting human rights and international legal order, then things need to change, and it's up to Canadians to make that change happen. And I say a great big thank you to all those hundreds of thousands of Canadians who've been coming out every week in demonstrations supporting Palestinian justice, freedom, and rights. Thank you.
For reporters on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. If you want to ask a question, pour les journalistes sur Zoom, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction main levée si vous avez une question. Merci. This concludes the press conference.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David.
Yep. Thank you too.
Thank you very much for coming out. Yeah. Don't know if